I purposely asked Harrison to read a larger portion of this morning's text because what I want to bring home to us this morning, that in the heart of Nehemiah, there was this godly unction and concern for his people back home in Jerusalem. Last week, Sunday evening, was a good meeting, and we had a wonderful discussion, and it presented so many opportunities that are ripe for us to participate in, get involved in, and being able to contribute to. I'm not quite sure how your life is, and maybe today you are bored stiff, and maybe you're around waiting for God to come and fetch you. But you see, so many times I watch this world. I've met an amazing woman this week. Dereck Beukes. How old is she about? Dereck Beukes is about 84 years old, and I was blessed that to be with Laurie, and he invited me along with him to meet with like-minded people when we are speaking about things that are of great importance for our country. But you see, here's a lady that really impacted my life because I watched her very carefully, how she articulated her concern for our country. There's a man by the name of Seth Gordon that I read an article about many years ago, and he said the following. He says, today, if you are bored, boredom is what empty space feels like. And you can use that empty space to go to something important. As soon as you're tired of being bored at work, at home, or even at lockdown, which you referred to at that time, wherever you go, you'll find a challenge. And I'm glad you're feeling bored. And now we're excited to see what you're going to do about it. That is exactly right what happens around us every single day. We can sit around and think through things very carefully and try to figure out just what we can do with our lives to make it more meaningful. Many years ago, I read a quote of a gentleman, and his name just fails me at the moment. He said, sometimes we are busy climbing ladders, but sometimes, and maybe at the end of your life, he said, God forbid that you find out that you have placed your ladder on the wrong wall, and that your whole life is spent on a purposeless pursuance of that which just will be destroyed in the fire. There's a man that always inspires my life, and I had a long reason to read through the book, a Bible that, the introduction of the Bible that I got this week. In the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, it was actually not each two individual books. It was one book in the old Jewish canon. And here we find that it gives the historical background to what was happening in Israel. When you read through the books of Kings and Chronicles, you'll find out that Israel was led by a few good kings and a few very bad kings. And they really and truly, the bad ones just took God's people further and further away from God. And eventually God had enough, and he sent them into captivity. He would allow the very thing that he promised them not to happen, delivered them into the hands of the pagan powers. 70 years later, they were finally released from captivity. But what we find later on, especially within the time of the captivity, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, he ransacked the whole of Jerusalem, completely destroyed that city. The lifestyle, the culture, and the values. Even the temple was destroyed. It was said that apparently he would burn down the walls of the temple because it was clad in gold. And they would literally remove all the rocks one from one another in order to get to the gold that is melted and is now sitting between the cracks of those rocks. And this man Nebuchadnezzar was one of the most motivated people around that would not leave any stone unturned. And he was an instrument of a righteous God. In the book of Isaiah, God speaks of this, and he said, I will personally deal with Nebuchadnezzar later, but he's an instrument in my hand for now. What you find that in Jerusalem at that time, there was no country. There was no identity. If you can imagine a demolished city, no economic structure, there were no jobs, no government, no leadership, no direction, and worst of all, there was no hope. You see, Many times when we read about wars in this world, we think especially of the German war, when Germany was completely annihilated as a nation. They had to pay war reparations. And yet we find in Japan the same thing when Hiroshima and Nagasaki was bombed. We find these people completely on their hands and knees. And we ask the question, what would have motivated these three nations to rebuild a nation today which are economic powers? The book of Ezra and Nehemiah gives us a glimpse into the history of Israel. Firstly, there were three great leaders that came in there. The first one was Zerubbabel, and he led the first group of Jews back and began to rebuild the temple. We find that Ezra the scribe led some Jews back. And here again, his role was specifically defined in Ezra chapter 7, verse 10, which says, Ezra had prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord and to do it, and to teach statutes and ordinances in Israel. In other words, he would drive the concept of identity found in God and in his word. The third one was Nehemiah. He was a practical man that led a group of people back to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. This morning we will look at Nehemiah. Nehemiah, as we know, was a cupbearer. I want you to consider the fact that he was an Israelite, but he was also in captivity. His position that he was in was a wonderfully privileged position. He had all the trappings of wealth. He was the man that stood between the rest of the contingent of politicians and the king, Nebuchadnezzar. He was the guy that would taste the food. He would check the food whether it was good quality. You do not come through anyone else but Nehemiah. And so his position was incredibly powerful, incredibly privileged. But we find there's something happens to Nehemiah. When some of his brethren comes back in Nehemiah chapter 1 verse 3, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress. And the walls of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are burned with fire. He turned around and it really affected him. He was told what had happened. Nehemiah knew that the gates had been destroyed 140 years before. But when he heard firsthand what was happening to his people, it affected him and he cried. I want to stop right there. So many times we find in a country that we are in, that people would say, I'm out of here, I'm going to find myself somewhere else and I'm going to relocate my family. But there are some folk that would turn around and say, hang on a minute, I've got this unction in my heart that I cannot stand by and seek my own and not do something about my people with whom I identify. He had a strong sense of identity. But I want you to watch how God would use this man in a very powerful way. He mourned, he wept, he fasted, and he prayed to God for days. He asked God for direction, how he was going to be used very powerfully in his kingdom. Sometimes, brethren, we would say that I have a feeling of concern. Then I lie down a little bit until the feeling passes. Not with Nehemiah. Nehemiah, somehow, he was not exactly one of these preacher type guys or an elder type or a deacon type. He was just an ordinary Joe like you and I. But what he understood was that God had placed this burden on his heart because he needed to do something about it. I want you to understand something very clearly. There's more to serving God than just talking about it. We all can come up with wonderful theories, and maybe some of them are just secular theories, who we know is about empire building. But there is a spiritual principle that will come through here that will help you understand that it is not only different, but it is superior to what this world can ever bring. History will tell you that God's perfect church, God's perfect economy had unbundled 4 empires and they were laid in ruin. When you start to understand that there is something more powerful about God's kingdom, you start to realize that every kingdom, no matter how powerful it is, that is set to dominate, that is set to enslave, God can take it apart. You see, brethren, one of the key things is that he had a divine burden on his heart. Something far greater than just saying, oh, well, I'll send 20 rand to so-and-so and hopefully it'll help them. There was something far greater. Craig Grushel made the comment, he says, the burden you bear often reveals the calling that you embrace. In other words, when you sit down and you think to yourself, I see a problem, and I see there's something that we are missing as a community. You don't sit around and start to say, well, I'm going to say nothing and I'll just watch how they go down. Let me say this to you. I'm warning you. This thing is serious. When we talk about a spiritual problem, it is an inclusive principle that includes all of us. Notice also this, that if you will not participate and help in reconstruction, God will do without you. But what you've been given will be taken away from you. That's a principle, and that's been tested in the Word of God, is written all over the pages of God. So that you can understand this is not a thumbsuck, but this is fact. That's where Nehemiah was. He embraced something so powerful. He was not a priest, he was not a prophet. In terms of Jewish leadership, he was nobody. But he was an ordinary servant. He was a cupbearer to a king. But he understood one thing and one thing only, that he could make a contribution. That he could, out of his influence where he was, he could make a difference. Nobody appointed him to that position. And that is why he was attacked later on in the book by Sanballat and Tobiah. He was accused of trying to be a leader, and that was not true. And he was accused of that by pagans that were inside of Jerusalem that didn't want him there. They were among God's people, but they were enemies of God's purposes. You see, what happened here was that the other Jews must have heard about the problems in Babylon. That were in Babylon would have heard about what's going on in Jerusalem. But some of them would just shake their heads and say, well, isn't that a shame? It's just a tragedy. It is very tough and it's so sad and so on. But you see, that is just a condescending feeling of, that's now a you problem, that's not a me problem. And that's sometimes exactly how we like to operate in the spiritual sphere. You see, brethren, so often when you feel that need that comes from Nehemiah, he also never allowed the overwhelming nature of the need to paralyze him not to do anything. Out of emotional survival, sometimes people will say, I need to preserve myself, and so I'll withdraw myself. Well, you go right ahead. You don't see that in the Bible, not from anyone that made a significant contribution to the kingdom of God. And that is called cowardice. And Revelation 21 verse 8 will tell you that you will not see the kingdom of God. All cowards won't go into heaven. The Church of Christ is an adversarial instrument that is designed to knock down all the powers of Satan. And it tells you in Matthew chapter 16 that he says that the gates of hell will not prevail against God's kingdom. And the person that said that wasn't some clown that was in a soapbox, but it was Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, the author of our faith. And I'm also not saying that you commit yourself impetuously to everything and every need that comes around. It's just not wise. But here's the key. There is something that you can do. And what Nehemiah says is that his heart broke when his people were struggling. It bothered him. I would imagine that Nehemiah probably also asked the question, surely there's other people that can do this. But then he realized that somebody's got to do something about it, but it might as well be me. He probably looked at his circumstances with regards to, and I'm referencing people like Esther that would have been reminded by Mordecai, telling her that, remember, you've been raised for a time like this. And if you miss this opportunity, God's salvation will come through someone else, Esther. But you and your family, you will be destroyed. It is a choice every one of us make. When you think that you can back out from the unction that God is calling you to, you're making a big mistake. Don't try to tell me that there's another way. God's way is one way, and it's a one-way street of total committed and single-minded discipleship, following the calling of Christ. But watch what Nehemiah does. The first thing that he does is what all of us do. We pray about it. Time and time again, we see Nehemiah going before God, praying and praying again. The first chapter tells us that he heard the news in the month of Kislev, which is normally November through to December. He starts praying, and he prays until the first of chapter 2, the month of Nisan. It would imply that for 4 months, this man was fasting and praying. He was imploring the God of glory and saying to him, I want you to notice that for 4 months, Lord, I'm taking this seriously. I need your help. God, give me the words. God, give me the wisdom. Please direct my steps. I don't find this in any of the books of Babylonia, writing up how to do things. That's why I'm coming to you. The one that placed this burden on my heart is going to be the one that's going to direct my steps and the one that's going to chart a course out of this. In chapter 2, we see that the king notices. And let me say this, it's a very important principle to notice, is that part of his life is to always be jovial, always be the positive cat around the king. Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar says to him, hey, but what's going on? What's going on with you? And then in verse 4, the king says to Nehemiah, what are you requesting? You see, he didn't just answer. Chapter 2, verse 4, he says, the king said to me, what do you request? And so I prayed to the God of heaven. And here, what Nehemiah teaches us, don't shoot your mouth off. Before you are even saying something in conversation, you stop and say, Lord, please capture my mouth that I don't say something that could be destructive to your cause. Pray, pray, pray. The one that has placed the burden on your heart is the one who will give you direction. You see, brethren, here's the key. Somebody here might have a heart for something. And you might say to yourself, you know what, I'm not big enough to be part, but I can become a part of. It says, maybe there's something that is so troubling in your heart that you say, I'm sure we can make a difference here. The first thing you do is you pray to God. The second thing you do is that you define your vision clearly. You start having a look at what you are up against. You see, one of the first things you do in any kind of research, academic research, is to define the parameters of your research. Identify the why. Identify what the problem statement is, what the problem is. State the problem in the most shortest way possible in a research proposal. The shortest way possible. State the problem statement. Nehemiah does exactly that. Verse 5, he answers, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. You see, all he said to him was, I can't see this going on. My father's graves are lying in ruins. My people are all over the place. I need to help them. You see, here we find that when you've stated your vision clearly, it's not caring about your problem, but also saying that, when you look at things, you look at the world around you, you say, well, I don't like illiteracy. Well, neither do I. But then we start looking around and saying, there are so many problems. Children that are abused, children that need medical care. We don't have enough homes for people. And maybe in our nation, there are opportunities that you see that are so glaring that you ask yourself the question, I'm going to need $1 trillion or $1 trillion, whatever the case is, to try to rectify what we are dealing with. Nebuchadnezzar asked him, what do you want from me? And then he says, please send me to Judah so that I can rebuild the walls. And here again, be clear to your boss and say, please, I need time off. I need to do this. When I sat with the elders saying to them that I needed time off, I needed time to rest, I needed time to study, I needed time to look around, to review what I know from the scripture and see in person some things that I needed to learn from. I needed to do some things for myself, some historical research. It's for my own learning and my wife's learning. In the third place, when you've got your vision and you've prayed, then the third one is you start to make a plan. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 6. Then the king said to Nehemiah, the queen also sitting beside him, how long will your journey be? And when will you return? I want you to know the following. He didn't say to the king, look, you caught me a little bit on the back foot here. I haven't really thought about it. I work for many excellent CEOs who are still part of massive corporations. I'm not talking about I'm talking about big corporations where they run multiple entities. And I remember speaking to one of them. It's a wonderful man, and I really wish I could see him again. He always said to me, Dereck, when you say something, be clear. Define your terms, and then tell me what you want. Our meetings were something like 3 to 5 minutes long. But I promise you, that guy had such an incisive mind that in 3 to 5 minutes, you could literally reach your question, you could tell him what you need, and it was done. And immediately, you got what you needed. And that's exactly what happens to men in that kind of leadership position, like Nebuchadnezzar. They didn't get there because they fell off a rock and it fell into their armpits and said, well, here's a kingdom for you to handle. These men had to be in command of large armies. They had to fight with infighting of political people that tried to usurp them. And to balance all those eventualities, he needed to know where he was at all the time. And then he says, if it pleases the king, send me. And when I had given him a time. Now Nehemiah told him what the time frame was. That was specific for the king and exactly how much time he would have needed. And it tells you that when you are planning something, be clear on your terms of reference. Don't come there with a half-hatched plan. Nehemiah chapter 2 verse 7, if it pleases the king, and he says to him, sir, I need the following. If it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the region beyond the river, that they must permit me to pass through till I come to Judah. In other words, he's saying, I need your voice to protect me where I am going. I need you to direct me, and I need your letter that I can present to them. Don't touch this man. Don't impede his progress. Let him through. And then he goes on and says in a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber and make beams for the gates of the citadel, which pertains to the temple, for the city wall, and for the house that I will occupy. He said, Lord, I want you to help me, because I need a place to stay while I'm working there. I also need something from you that'll help me. I want you to instruct Asaph, so Asaph can cut timber for me, so I can have that to take with. So when I build a place for me to live in, I've got everything that I need. In other words, tell the cat that's in charge of the stores that he will release what I need so I can do my job. He was very clear. Sometimes we say, well, there's so much hunger and so much starvation, and we're so immobilized. The fourth point that he did was very powerful, is to inspire other people to follow and to see what he sees. You see, the fourth principle of this entire book is he says that I want you to understand that this is not a me problem, but it's a we problem. Sometimes, brethren, when we look at budgetary constraints, we often say, well, I don't know how they're going to do that. Well, here's the story. Let me lay it out to you very clearly. It's a we problem. Okay? It's a we problem. It's not a me problem. It's an us problem. When it comes to the kingdom, every single one of us had been submitted to the will of God. It's your choice to withdraw your will from God, but the consequences you will bear. You see, the key behind it all is that Nehemiah made it clear, and he says that this is a we problem. Look how he deals with the church, Nehemiah 2:17. You see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies waste and its gates are burned with fire. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem so that we will no longer be a reproach. He was talking to people that are in captivity. Let me speak to you about something that you might not have thought about. The humankind's ability to adapt to adverse circumstances is incredible. And so too we find it here, that people in captivity were comfortable there. But he was saying to them that way back home, your family is in distress. This is an issue where, yes, sure, we are in captivity here, but there are others that are in worse shape than we are. The Apostle Paul speaks of that in Corinthians 8 and 9. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 speaks of the blight in Jerusalem, where they said, let us send resources to help them. They are ours. We are one. It's a we problem. Let us rise in verse 18 and build. You see, this motivation wasn't just a one-time thing. It was an intentional focus to say, let's get on with it. I often speak to people that are struggling with depression. Have a plan and work your plan. And then go to like-minded people who can guide you through to navigate it accurately. Verse 18, Nehemiah said, and I told them of the hand of my God which had been good upon me. He says, I told them that God has been good to me, that I've got a functionality here in captivity. But I cannot ignore the fact that there are people back in my hometown that hasn't got food on their table. And I'm comfortable to say, that's a you problem. You see, brethren, in verse 18, some of the burdens that God lays on our hearts, we can accomplish all by ourselves. But there's some of them that we need to accomplish together. But the principle is that God will never leave us, nor will He forsake us. John Wesley made a comment many years ago that is still true. He says, light yourself on fire with passion with God for people. And people will come from miles to watch you burn. And the picture is that you and I must be passionate about the kingdom of God, so that people can see that we are serious about the kingdom values and the reign of Christ being held supremely in our life, and that every aspect of our life is subordinated to the will of God. Many years ago, I spoke to Stephen Leibrand, and I think he was sitting in the exact chair that he's sitting in now, and I told him about what I saw in Santa Cruz. And right there, him and I started praying about it. Today, we've got a program, I think it's running into its, how many years, Celia? Running into its 8th year. And here's the key. There are folk that saw that they could make a difference. They saw that they could change the lives of these children. Within 5 years, and Celia received an award, and so did this church, of the greatest contribution that school improvement in its academics had outstripped all other schools in its improvement. That was exactly the time when we started, and those kids became, they exited the matric. You and I can do that. You see, Susan has an unction for the kids at Santa Cruz. She goes and works with the people, with Jenny and with Mariki and Cecile. And they work with folk that probably in this lifetime would never have the opportunity to read Morning Star. What did I say? You know what I mean. Morning Star. And even yesterday, we took the children to the beach. I think it was 15, 16 children. I've never in my life heard such a screaming and shouting and ranting and raving with Wayne and myself and Sue and a couple from Morning Star. The children were singing. In fact, the kid that was driving with me in the car, he says to me, excuse me, does that radio of yours work? And I said, no, I never switch on the radio. I just like silence. Because I don't like, I like to think while I'm driving and pray. And he says, is it? Okay. But while we were driving, Wayne rocked up there with a lot of kids in the car. And I promise you, I saw that Fortuna do this. Doosh, 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 doosh. Children were singing, they were shouting, and we had an absolute wonderful day out on the beach. One of the children came and he said, you've changed the way that I look at myself. You see, brethren, here's the key. All it cost was a few rands and 5-6 hours out of our day. But the investment will have an eternal impact in the lives of these children around us and people around us. And so we are never selfish. You see, because we are kingdom-minded, whatever we get from God in the one hand, we give with the next hand, and we become conduits of His glory. We become conduits of the goodness that God has. And it reminds us back to chapter 12 and 17 of the Abrahamic promise that God has given by faith, where He said, you must be a blessing to the nations. Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 11 is selfishly interpreted as God is going to make me good. It's not true. Inside of that very promise and instruction to God's people, He tells them, I want you to go and seek the good of the city. You see, brethren, here's the key. If you do not improve the world around us, let this thing stand on its head and put it right side up where Christ is King. Many years ago, I watched a guy who was in charge of a massive corporation. And he was giving a talk, I think it was a TED talk, I wish I could come across it again. And this particular man got in the trenches in a very, very difficult community in Africa. And he started to help them to dig trenches. And one of the fundamental errors that were made in that trench was that the angle of the water flow was incorrect. And so what he did was he didn't stand there and say, oh, you idiot. He jumped into the trench and he said to them, let me show you how it's done. And then he said, what you're doing here now is we are trying to direct filth, all the garbage out of the bathrooms and the toilets down to a landfill where it's going to be composted. And he says the angle is crucial so that it can flow down and not stay in the pipe. And here was a man that is probably worth a couple of $1 billion jumping in the trenches. And he showed them how. And then he made a comment which I will never forget. The interviewer wrote to him and says, why are you doing this? He says the most important part of a healthy economy and of democracy is that you are continually developing your potential market, because the better they do, the better we do. It's a fool that thinks that he can only pocket things for himself. It's a person that's not kingdom-minded, that thinks that God's kingdom resides around my belly button. It's greater than that. And so this morning I implore you to think differently about your life this year. The next couple of weeks we're going to be speaking about opportunities to serve. I cannot begin to tell you, sitting in a meeting last week Sunday with people that love God, that honors God with their lives unselfishly, put up their hand and said, count me in. Let me say this to you. Sometimes we feel we have the right to say, well, this is not as good. But I'm going to say what another brother said to me. This is the best we got because they've stepped forward. And maybe you think that you are better. And maybe you are. But we will work with the best that we've got. The book of the Bible will tell you to the nth degree between David and Saul, that Saul thought he was better, and his life ended in ruins. And God took a man like David, a nobody, and He changed the world and the direction of His people. You better learn from history. You better learn from history that God's not looking for superstars. He's looking for a humble and a willing heart. The heart like Nehemiah. Men that was a nobody, today is written about for all of us to read and to learn about. Maybe this morning you feel in your heart you want to turn to God. I want to encourage you to do that. It's the best thing you could possibly do. Why? Because you are living right here. Yeah. And God's saying, I'm calling you upward. There. I'm calling you higher. There's more. There's more to this life. Rip the juices out of it. And let's get together, put shoulder to the wheel, and turn this world right side up with Christ at its head, as He intended it to be. May God be glorified this year more than ever before by our lives. Let's stand and close with a song for invitation.